Hello everyone, and today we're talking about cameras. So, I have been asking myself this thing about beginner cameras, like your first camera that you are going to buy, and I've been seeing on YouTube, especially a lot of people going through all the beginner options like the Sony A6000 or A6100, the Canon M50 Mark 1 or Mark 2. And I've been wondering, why are people recommending those cameras? And because when I see those, and I own one of them, I hit my mark there. When I see those options, I'm like, but those cameras are limited. I do not want to have a camera that has big compromises that you have to get and to live with when I'm starting out. I just don't want to be that, frustrated with my gear. And I've been searching for the perfect beginner camera and to establish a list of requirements for this beginner camera thing. And I think I've been able to find the perfect one. So, what makes a good beginner camera? Well, I'm a guy that shops primarily when it comes to camera gear and other tech stuff. I shop primarily secondhand. So I've seen a lot of those examples on secondhand websites generally, where you see cameras and camera kits that have barely been used actually. And it's just that people wanted to go into photography or videography or whatever, and they just wanted to get a camera to do it, and then once they got it, just didn't use it, and it's sat on the shelf for 3 to 4 months, and after that time they just figured out that just to get that a bit of that money back. And generally those camera kits are like north of $1,000, especially in France, where it's a bit more expensive on that front. And I mean, a basic camera kit like an A6000 with it's a 15 to 50 lens, the kit lens, the pose zoom one, it's like 750, sometimes $800 depending on where you shop, and that can be a huge problem, I think, especially when you have second-hand options that are so much cheaper, and it's an investment that will not hurt you as much. So in my opinion, the perfect beginner camera is 100% going to be a second-hand one, because of the price, first of all, and because for a way lower cost you will have access to cameras that are either professional cameras or mid-range to in that price range when they got out, like a camera that is weather sealed, that has nice features, nice buttons, nice dials, maybe a nice sensor sometimes, anyway. And that can be really a potential for good gear gathering, rather than just buying new at your local tech store and not getting everything that you could get, right, for the money. And the second point is the learning potential. So in photography, there's two aspects that needs to be understood and learned in order to get good photos. The one is composition, which you can learn with a phone or anything. It's not really dependent on the camera. And the second one is exposure. So in my opinion, that's just my opinion, is just like, in order to run, you need to know how to walk first. And that's exactly what I think manual exposure and semi-automatic modes like aperture priority and all those modes are. Those automatic modes are running, and the manual mode is learning how to walk, like learning what the shutter speed is, learning what the ISO is, learning what the aperture is, and what everything of that does to your photographs, to your pictures. So you need to be I bumped my camera there, sorry. You need to be able to learn on that camera, just like any other activity you make. the easier it is to learn, the faster you will progress into your hobby. So that's one thing that I think budget entry-level cameras, and I'm not going to call them beginner cameras anymore, but entry-level cameras are just not good enough. So I have an example right there, and that's the Canon M50 that I bought about a year ago. That was my first serious camera, and spoiler, I swapped cameras since I don't know what to do with that. It's a secondary video camera at the moment, but if I want to shoot manual with that camera, I have only one control dial, and I have a combination of buttons to go through if I want to change my aperture or my ISO, and that dial doing all the job, and it barely change anything on the screen. Like if I turn my dial 3 clicks when I'm moving the ISO, it's the same difference as if I was moving my shutter speed or my aperture when it comes to the exposure. Alright, so future editor me talking. What I meant to say here is the fact that I don't have a way to understand if there is a difference. Obviously, turning 1/3 of a stop of the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO will have the same result on the exposure, but what I wanted to talk about was the fact that if I don't pay attention to it, I don't have any way of knowing that I turned one setting specifically and not one at random. Back to the video. So if I'm not paying attention enough, I will have problems with that. So I will have photos taken at, I don't know, f/22 and the shutter speed of 1.3 seconds is going to be all blurry and stuff. That's not great. And since I got through the process of learning through that camera, I know how difficult it is for someone that doesn't know anything about cameras. So it needs to be easy to learn, and that those cameras are not good at it. And there is another thing with the Canon M50 in particular, which I don't like, is the fact that you are not really able to grow into the system. There is the M6 Mark II, which is the model above that, and then if you want to get a higher end Canon camera, you need to go full frame. And to me, that's kind of a problem. I mean, full frame is what it is, right? Sure, but it's expensive and you need to change all of your lenses. You can't use your M-mount lenses like that kit lens, which is optically not the worst. Like it's okay, but you can't use it. It's like go back in the trash with your old camera, basically. So you don't have really the opportunity to grow into something better down the line. You need to swap all your lenses, all your cameras, if you want to get into a better system. That is a problem, and that is why I think you shouldn't be looking at cameras that have these kind of things. So typically the Sony a6000, if you want to grow, yeah, you can use your lenses, but if you want to grow, the only higher end cameras are going to be either a6600, a6500 type of camera, which don't have an upgrade into the sensor. Only like ergonomic upgrade and stuff. If you want a sensor upgrade, you will have to go through the full frame line, which means that your lenses will not be able to use them properly, or the camera you will not be able to use it properly either way. And same thing for Nikon, for example, where you can technically use full frame glass on the Z50 and the ZFC, but if there is no higher end APS-C camera in the Nikon line, and I think that's a problem too. So this is coming to my point of the best beginner camera that you can get. I think you guys know where I'm coming where I'm coming from, where I'm going. It's the fact that you need to be able to learn exposure on the camera. You need to be able to have a good line of lenses and the ability to upgrade your camera down the line. That's that kind of stuff. And it needs to be cheap. So what camera does, you know, fulfill all those points? And there is only one. I mean, there is a few, but the one I'm talking about is the one that fulfilled them the best, like in the best way. Okay, so that camera is the Fujifilm X-T1. And why this camera of all cameras? Well, let's talk about the first point that I talked about, which is the price. It can be had, at least in my country, as I said, for between 250 to 300 bucks or something like that. And I think it's a wonderful value for several reasons. So that's the price argument. If I compare this to my Canon M50, I bought it with two kit lenses, which are good but not great, and I paid 900 bucks for that. 900 bucks. Yay. So if I remove the price of the lenses for the Canon, that would mean like I'd paid something like 600 bucks for the camera body, and that's way too much in my opinion compared to what this is giving me. So now let's go into the second part that I talked about, which is the learning process you have with your camera. And I talked about how entry-level cameras don't have all the features that you would want them to have, like separate control for all your exposure settings. And this is exactly what this camera is providing. So I'm gonna use an old lens because the only prime lens which is small enough to show you properly here is filming me right now, so that's not particularly great to show people things, but just imagine that I'm using a Fujifilm lens and that it has an aperture ring. I'm using instead an old adapted Nikon lens, but the thing is the exact same. So when it comes to exposure, when you're learning, you want to be able to separate everything to know what it's actually doing to your picture, right? I bumped my tripod again. So when it comes to the Fuji X-T1, you have your exposure parameters here. Here you have the shutter speed. Here you have the ISO, and on the lens, you will have your aperture here. So looks like that. So it's a minor lens, so bear in mind. And if you are using later on, you learn how to do everything with your camera, and you want to use I don't know, exposure, a semi-automatic mode when it comes to exposure. You want to use aperture priority, for example. You just turn that to A, like that, and you will have that exposure compensation dial here. While on the M50, if I wanted to do the same thing, I would need to go into the aperture priority menu right there. Okay, then I would have to go through the quick menu on the touch screen to enable the exposure compensation thing, and that's not great. That's not a good experience. At least it wasn't for me. Okay, so in my opinion, this is the best way to learn photography and in particular exposure. Now let's go to the usability of the camera. And as I said, on the M50 there is not enough dials, there is not enough buttons to do everything. On that camera you have a D-pad that is fully customizable. You have a back and a front dial if for whatever reason you bought an XC lens, which I have one right here, or you have a Veltrox lens or Sigma lens that don't have an aperture ring on this, and you want to control your aperture, you just have your front dial here, like this. So it's pretty good. And when it comes to the drive modes, which, I don't know, for some reason you see a bird, you have a long lens on it because you're on a hike or something, and you see a bird and you want to do a burst, but you never done it before, it's just right there on the drive mode dial here. Just go to continuous high or low depending on what you want to do, and it's easy to find. It's buried into menus on the M50, and I hate that state of fact, you know. So that's a camera that is really easy to understand and really simple to use, and I wouldn't I wouldn't consider any camera to be better when the way it functions when it comes to a beginner. Okay, so now we go to the third point I talked about, which is the ecosystem. And if let's go back to the Canon example, right? So if I wanted to upgrade that camera, what could I keep from my actual camera kit? So I could go either for, let's say, a Canon M6 Mark II. I would keep the lenses and I would have that M50 as a backup. Cool, good move. But then all your batteries are different. This is LPE12 and the M6 Mark II use LPE17, which are bigger. So you have two standards of batteries that are different that you need to know how to use, and don't confuse them, because maybe you will not take the right batteries for the right camera, and it could be confusing for someone that's starting out. I mean, if you are buying your second camera, you're not starting out anymore, but that can be confusing. On the Fuji side, you have your batteries that are all NPW126. You have the 126 and the 126S, but basically those are the same batteries, more or less. So you have only one battery for all cameras except the X-T4, but the X-T4 is pretty high-end, I would say. And all the lenses are X-mount, they are the same. If I go back to the M50 again, if I wanted to go a bit higher than the M6 Mark II, I would go to, I don't know, the RP or the R or the R6, something like that. I will have to swap all my lenses and all my batteries as well. So is why. So that's, and finally, I mean, on that front, Canon is doing better. I'm comparing a lot Fuji and Canon. I'm not talking about Nikon or Sony because I don't have any of them of their cameras yet, so I can't really say. But I have a Canon. I've been keeping an eye on what they're doing, so I can say. But they are getting more RF lenses, RF lenses.
Wow.
That are more keen to budget consumers. Like, it's not professional $2,000 lenses or anything like that, and that's exactly what Fujifilm has been doing in these past years. Like, they have budget options, mid-range options, and high-end options for pretty much every focal length. So good for beginners. There is another additional kind of things that the X-T1 brings to the table. So you have weather sealing, and I've mentioned it, but it's, I think, one of the most underrated aspects of a beginner camera. So when you buy your first camera, you don't know what they can go through when it comes to the weather, the rain, the dust, the humidification of the air, I don't know. So sometimes it's gonna be, you know, a bit wet outside, it's gonna be raining, and there's going to be risks of rain or something, and you will just fear for your camera, so you will just not take it with you. It's gonna be left in the bag or left at home, and you will not use it. I know that's what happened to me with the M50, because I know this is not weather sealed, this is all plastic. I don't know any joints where the buttons are, and I was not confident in that camera holding up. This is very well sealed, and if you have the chance of having a weather sealed lens with it, it's okay for you. And I think that's a thing that can block some people off. It's not a requirement or anything like that, otherwise all cameras would be weather sealed, but it's nice to have. Not a requirement, but it's nice to have. Next, there is all the accessories, but that is something that is really a Fuji thing. All Fuji cameras have a lot of accessories to go through, like hand grips, thumb grips, etc. Since it's a professional one, you also have access to a vertical grip option, if that's something that you want. It's kind of cheap, like you can get one off Amazon for $40 to $50, so that's not too expensive. And the last thing, which grow into camera system kind of thing, is the fact that you have a UHS 2 card slot on the side here. It's not the same compartment as the battery, but that's not the biggest deal. And having a UHS 2 card slot here means that if you ever upgrade your camera gear and you use the X-T1 as a backup camera, you maybe would want to use faster cards. Like I'm using currently an X-T2, I have UHS 2 card slot to take advantage of the faster ports. I can take those cards into the X-T1 and do not lose any performance or anything like that because it's UHS 2. I don't have any money left on the table because I have a fast card into a slow camera body. It has a UHS 2 card slot. That's the third time I said this. Anyway. So, with everything said, I need to go through the specs of the camera to be aware of the limitations. So, it has a 16.3 megapixel sensor, which is an X-Trans 2 sensor. It's one of the nicer ones when it comes to colors, but when it comes to definition, it's a notch behind all the other X-Trans. Obviously, this one is 24 megapixel, for example. Neither of those have anti-aliasing filter thanks to the X-Trans color grid array, so it's not like on the M50, for example, where it's 24 megapixels, but the image is a bit less sharp because it has an anti-aliasing filter, which is needed because it has a Bayer color grid array. And I think that's a detail, but when I'm comparing the sharpness of the images between my M50 and my X-T1, I can't really see a difference. So I don't know if that's the anti-aliasing filter that does something, or if that's just me not being able to see the difference between 16 and 24 megapixels. Anyway, that's how things are. The resolution on that camera is maybe a notch behind all the contemporaries, but I mean, in the grand scheme of things, that doesn't really matter for 90% of people. If you are posting things on social media, no problem. If you are printing, as long as it's not like 4 by 3 meters, not gonna have a problem. So, good thing. Last thing to be aware of, it's a 2014 camera. The last firmware update that bring, I don't know, zoned focusings or things like that made it correct for autofocus. Those firmware updates were in 2015, so it's 2015 technology when it comes to autofocus. But it works quite well, but you will have limitations. It's obviously not as good as this. This is dual pixel autofocus. It's way better. It's gonna be also behind things like the Sony x6000, which has better autofocus system. It's workable, even for beginner people. I didn't have any problem with it, and I had only like 3 months of experience when I bought that camera, no problem. On the subject of autofocus, I need to talk about video, and the video on that camera is not great. There is several things that are limitations, like the record limit of 10 minutes. I have the same in 4K with my X-T2. That's not really a problem, but that can be. It caps out at 1080p 60 frames per second with autofocus, just like the M50. It can do 4K with a heavy crop, and no autofocus, no reliable one at least. So I'm not going to count that into the spec list. But yeah, 1080p 60, that's the maximum with autofocus, which is not really reliable. It's not fast. And the last point is that the video quality by itself, it's 1080p, but it's rather soft 1080p. It's not that great. It's not that good. And the microphone ports on the X-T2, it's 3.5mm jack, just like on the M50. But yeah, it's a 2.5. And it's combined with a remote port. You will need an adapter to plug in a standard microphone. That's a downer, I know. The last thing that you need to be aware of is the grip tapes. The plastic bits on the camera are rather old. Obviously, since this camera has been discontinued, I don't know, late 2015, early 2016, something like that, all the models, the copies that you will find online that are secondhand, are going to be pretty old ones that generally have been used pretty heavily because the people that bought these used them. So mine came with pretty beaten down grip tapes, especially on the front and the back. I replaced the one in the back. It came off almost immediately, like into within a month of use, and I glued it back with super glue, and it hasn't come out since. And so that's one positive. I mean, it's workable. It's not the end of the world, but it's just something to be aware of. And personally, I'm not doing video with that camera, so that's not a problem. But I glued the port door here as well because it was bulging like hell, and it was opening itself basically, so raining the weather sealing, everything like that. And since I shoot sometimes in the rain, I didn't want to kill my camera with that kind of thing. So that's also something to keep in mind. So I went through the negative and the positive of the X-T1, and I think the positives outweighs tremendously the negatives when it comes to usability for people that are starting out. I need, though, to mention other options that could be, depending on the way you look at it, better for you. So if you want the same kind of performance when it comes to autofocus and sensor, you have the XE2, which is basically the X-T1 but in rangefinder style and without the weather sealing and the UHS2 card slot, that kind of thing. It's a lower end camera, it's like mid-range, it's not pro like this one, and it does not have vertical grip options. You have some accessories like all Fuji cameras do on the second-hand, on the third-party market, and yeah, it's basically a very good camera. If you want something cheaper, there is the XE1, which is basically the XE2 but with the X-Trans 1 sensor and the previous gen processor, which means that you will have less film simulations and less performance when it comes to autofocus and that kind of stuff. So it's still a very good camera for the price. Like you can get that for 150-ish euros in Europe. The XE2 is about the same price as the X-T1, and it doesn't have the ISO dial, so that's why I think the X-T1 is the better choice overall. I didn't mention it, but it has a tilt screen as well. It's not the end of the world if you don't have the tilt screen, however, having it is a good thing. Yeah, other cameras like the X Pro 1, the X-T2 are going to be in a completely other price bracket, especially the X Pro 1, which has basically an XE1 performance, so less performance but more expensive. It's just because it has an OVF. Still no weather sealing, anything. Like the XE1 is the exact same camera when it comes to performance and features, so something to keep in mind. I'm just going to touch over the post-processing thing about all the Fuji cameras compared to all the other cameras. Is that for beginners, sometimes it's easier to go through things like, you know, photo editing, because you can skip it altogether thanks to film simulations and film recipes that you can get from the internet, if there is not the film stock that you want to emulate that baked in the camera. I mean, I know that for my part, most of the work that I did with the X-T1 when I got it, I was just JPEGs and I used Classic Chrome with a few tweaks like the shadow tones and stuff like that. But anyway, it's very good option for people that don't want to edit photos. And if you want to edit photos, it still has very nice RAW files. So I have the feeling I should have mentioned that earlier into the video, but it just came to my mind right now. So anyway. I think that's everything I wanted to say about this particular camera, the X-T1, and why this is in 2022 or even in 2023 one of the best beginner camera that you can get right now. Alright, conclusion time. If you like this video, well, definitely leave a like if you want, and if you disliked it, be sure to dislike as well. If there is some recommendation I could do to improve all those videos, definitely put them in the comments below, and get subscribed for all the videos that's coming. In particular, the comparison within the X-T2, which is filming me right now, and the X-T1. Is it worth spending more money to get the X-T2, or is it just more worth to get the XT1 because there is no much difference. I guess we will find out. With that note, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.